Thank you so very much, Rachel, for that introduction and for really laying the framework for our event and for our conversations today. It's really a pleasure to work alongside you in this work, and I'm really excited to sort of jump into our conversation. And so, as she mentioned, our first panel is the why before the how, and I'd like to invite our two panelists to join me in this conversation, which I'm really excited. We have Andrew DeFranza, Executive Director from Harborlight Community Partners, and Bob Terrell, who is a member of our CHAPA Fair Housing Committee, and also a member of the Affirmatively Furthering for Housing Community Advisory Committee that's also going to be honored today for their work. So I invite you to unmute yourselves and join me as we hope to sort of also pin us so that others can see us on screen and begin our conversation. So thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for having us, Whit.
Of course, of course. Really, it's my pleasure because I'm really, really excited about this conversation, and I love to really just jump right in. Question I'd love to sort of start us with is really, as we center ourselves in today's conversation, we're making an appeal, right, to hearts as we continue to acknowledge that fair housing is a civil rights issue at its core. Why is it important then, maybe more so than ever, that we really focus and center our work in the why before the how? Andrew, did you want to jump in and start us off?
Sure, and it's delightful to be here with you all and share the Zoom boxes with Whitney and Bob. It's an honor and nice to see everybody and be seen. So I think partially what I would say, at least as a jumping off point, is in a situation like this where the stakes are so incredibly high and the work is hard and long, right? We're in a moment in time where we've been handed a set of responsibilities from those who went before us. As Rachel cited, the Fair Housing Act, and we're doing our part during our shift for those who are going to come after us. And that's critical work at a broad level, almost a spiritual, ethical level. It's elevated work in that way. And so I think for the kind of hard this is, the kind of change that we're looking to make, it is important that we are rooted, all of us, in the reasons why we think this is important, why we think this is an ethical issue. This is not, while this is manifest and rooted in how we talk about policy and both at a local and a state and a federal level, it gets manifested in different mechanisms and ways that this plays out in the world. But at the beginning, at the root of this is the question of why. And we need to know that we have strong reasons because the work has to be strong and durable and compelling in the way that we handle it. And I think where we really then start is we know that there were a series of intentional wrongs over a long period of time that were done to certain groups of people that had dramatic generational compounding impacts for the bad, for negative, for certain groups, and dramatic compounding long-term generational impacts of good for others. And so a long-term series of intentional wrongs can only be undone or addressed by a long-term series of intentional rights. And so we're here to talk about, I think, why are we here? Because this is an ethical problem, and we have the drive and the reason to think hard about what those rights are, and then to do the hard, long work of building coalitions to encourage those right policies to happen, to help make right the long-term wrongs that were done. So I think we have to have strong reasons, and we could go into why, what some of those intentional wrongs are and what some of those intentional goods need to be. But I think we care about this because a series of ethical wrongs were done that we all currently are either benefiting from or suffering under. And it's our spot, it's our shift, it's our rotation. And so it's our responsibility to do the right things that need to get done now. And it's I think that's a sacred and big responsibility that we're all undertaking. So I think that's a good jumping off point as to why is this so important?
So good. Bob, things to add there. You talked about it, an elevated issue, right? A series of intentional actions that we must take. Other thoughts there as far as why we really need to start with the why?
Well, I think starting with the why is absolutely essential these days because democracy is under attack. I never thought that I would see the rise of fascism in America. And I never dreamed that it would be put forward by a failed real estate developer. This is a critical moment for the country. It has been building for quite some time. I think it culminated on January the 6th with a direct attack on our democracy. And I personally believe the best way to defend a democracy is to expand it and not be timid and talk about, well, let's, nibble around the edges and make a few reforms. I think we have to be very intentional and very deliberate in expanding our democracy. And in terms of the why, in order to even understand what the why means, the country is going to have to finally confront that it has two tracks. One of my professors at Bowdoin College called it the official America. It's the America that we read in the history books, that we hear in campaign speeches, that we get in civics class. That's the official America. But there's another America where the real impulse for democracy really comes from, which was born out of grassroots movements from the bottom up. I was watching a documentary during Black History Month that dealt with the history of Virginia, and they pointed out that Virginia was the first colony to institute representative democracy. And 2 months later, the brother of the governor of the colony purchased 19 people of African descent. So right from the very inception of the country, we had this contradiction between supposedly democratic principles on the one hand and slavery and everything that is meant to the country, all in the same time, in the very community, in the very same community. And that dichotomy has existed throughout our entire history. And it's been reinforced at certain times. Just think about who was at the Constitutional Convention and who was not. And when Benjamin Franklin walked out of the convention and three ladies stopped him in the street and they said, "Dr. Franklin, what kind of government do we have now?" And he said, "A republic, if we can keep it." Notice he did not say it was a democracy. And when you think about how democracy has evolved in this country, it's evolved because of grassroots organizing from below. It wasn't because the powers that be decided to democratize the system. It was because all the people who were left out of that Constitutional Convention over the years pushed to expand American democracy.
So there's some work we have to do.
So we have a lot of work to do, and we're at a very, very critical juncture in this country's history because things could go in any number of directions. So the work around fair housing and civil rights broadly is absolutely essential at this point in time.
Agreed. So to that point really about understanding the history of really how we got here, right, and centering ourselves in the why, I guess it leads well into my next question, which is, how do you all see the issues of balancing housing affordability with whether or not people can afford to live in a community, what choices they have to make, what they have to deal with, right? Their safety, all these types of issues. And what do we miss if we fail to center our work in understanding that not only the present circumstances, but also the historical and systemic impacts of how we got here in our housing work? So how do we also make those connections? Bob, did you want to start off there?
I knew you were going to pick on me.
Picking on you?
With regard to affordability, I think we need to have a complete remaking of our definition of affordability. Every time in our community, when we review development projects and we look at what people consider affordability and we do the math, about 75% of the folks in our neighborhood can't afford what they're being told is an affordable unit, because the continued use of the area median income as the standard is skewed so high that none of the folks in our communities can meet that standard. And what it also does, it causes a little bit of a political backlash, because now people are starting to believe that, well, affordable housing doesn't mean anything to most of the people in the community because they can't buy into it. So we really need to adopt a different approach, I think, based on the median income of the city that you live in, or in the median income of the neighborhood where the development is located, whichever is lower. Now, we've been trying to get the city of Boston to adopt this policy for quite some time. It's been a real battle, but I think that's the only way to get a better distribution of housing resources to the people that need it.
That's great. Andrew, anything to add there? And then also to sort of thinking about the issues of affordability, but also, our community's welcoming. Are we meeting the goals that we sort of set out with our intentions of sort of, as Bob was talking about with AMI and all these different things? Are we meeting the goals of creating communities that are diverse and welcoming and safe and all of those other things as well? Andrew?
Yeah, it's really interesting, Whitney, and I think important again to start at the why and bring in some ways the questions of how we got here in different communities, right? We work in a lot of communities where there is an assumption that the reality that they experience in their life was somehow divinely originated. I had a preacher once in our area talking about how on the 8th day God created triple deckers in this community and single family zoning in this community, as if it was from the beginning of time. And so important to tie back to the intentionality that's at the beginning of this, that we're part of a historical stream, right? We're part of a thread that says this is where we are at the moment, and this is how we got here, and this is who benefited and who didn't. And now we have that situation, that reality, and there's questions then about what we're going to do about it. So I do think a huge part about this is to consider in the public discussions what the assumptions are of the speakers or of the positions about how the situation got the way it is, who's benefiting and who's supposed to be benefiting. Because if you trip any of those wires, which we often do, and you say to somebody, well, I think we ought to build this kind of housing in this place, if you violate one of the assumed rules, even that might be outside the consciousness of the speaker. I had a couple of folks last week complaining about a project we're trying to build, and they were deeply offended that I would try to build a multifamily building in a single family zone. They felt like I had violated a law of nature. Actually, the word that they used was irresponsible. That was the quote. And so then I had to draw out, well, how is that? In what ways do you see that as irresponsible? And then we got into a larger discussion. But so I think it matters to know what are the assumptions of who's talking. And I think where we would land is, in a little bit to Bob's point, regardless of whether we're talking about communities where we're trying to create access or communities where we're trying to mitigate displacement, which in my mind are sort of the two ends of the spectrum that we're worried about. There's a lot in between, but those are sort of the two ends. Is if you use services in a community that require workers to perform them that earn an income of X, or you have seniors in your community who've worked there and whose incomes are now fixed, or if you have people with disabilities or other challenges who are looking to find home in your community. It's our opinion that every community in the Commonwealth should have a range of economic access for different types of people. Not that that should be isolated to certain communities and not others, not that only certain communities should be livable, and not that we should be telling communities what they should or shouldn't do, but that it should be an ethical standard, a standard of fairness, if you will, that if you need somebody to do job X in your community, and we're thinking about this a lot now around the essential workers conversation. If you relied on essential workers in the last year in the pandemic, and you live in a really affluent place, it should matter to you that those workers could live near where they're providing services that you are partaking of, that there is an inviolable symbiosis that's both economic in some ways and spiritual in other ways, regardless of whether you believe that or not. It's like gravity or air. And so I really think we should challenge the assumptions in the places, especially where there's exclusion. I think we should challenge the assumptions about who it is who gets to be in a place, because we get a lot of, in the language of your question, we get a lot of, I saw this even this week, why don't, people should go to a place that they can afford, by which they generally mean they should drive a long way from wherever they're going to live to provide the services I want them to do at a wage rate that is lower than would be livable near me. That's essentially what they want. And I think we should resist that, both in the locations where exclusion is the norm, and then to Bob's point, in the locations where we're really concerned about displacement or local access. And I think it's the same problem and the same logic, but I think we have to challenge the thinking behind the assumptions in order to end up with policies that are different and have different outcomes.
That's great. I'm so glad we are talking about that. It's sort of maybe two democracies. We're talking about two sort of communities, displacement communities, and historically exclusionary communities. Like this, there's really sort of this well-roundedness. I see lots of amen moments in the chat and folks who are really excited about this conversation. I want to make sure we get through this next question, next few questions as well. So the next one is, so it has been recently asserted that racism is not growing so much as it's being recorded, right? With the murder of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, to name a few, and the raised consciousness of racial disparities during the COVID-19 pandemic in our country, what is to be said of the changed minds of societies overall? Do you believe minds have changed? And what work is necessary for us to help people make the connections from this moment and this movement of the policy changes that are needed to create fair housing and equitable communities for the long term? How do we make those connections in this moment? Either of you want to jump in on that first?
Bob is younger than me, so I'm going to defer to him.
Thank you. And
There it
speaking for millennials everywhere, yeah, people's minds have changed, but it's very interesting that the change that's sweeping through the country has many layers to it, and it's moving in many different directions and sometimes in opposing directions. The president was on last night, and he gave his State of the Union address to Congress. And what was very interesting about that address, it reminded a lot of us of something that Roosevelt would have said, or something that President Johnson would have said. We haven't had a president in 40 years that put forward basically a social democratic agenda for the country. And he decided to go big rather than go small. He said the crisis that we face in this country requires large scale solutions. And that's a big change politically in this country. We haven't had a president do that in 40 years. And I think part of the reason is what we saw last summer, and the protests and the rise of a serious racial justice movement in this country has helped to push certain conversations where they need to go. Again, major change coming about because people who've been left out of the democracy are pushing to expand. On the other hand, the country is changing demographically. The impact of technology is being felt every day. The COVID crisis obviously has brought a lot of our inequalities and problems to the forefront. But there are those who are very deeply entrenched and don't want America to change. As a matter of fact, if you read the political logic behind a lot of their statements, they want to go back to where America was in 1900. I mean, they want to go so far back, they even reject the progress we made under the New Deal. That's how far back they want to go. So we're dealing with a part of the country that wants to move forward and another part of the country that wants to move backward. And what's interesting is that the political landscape is really changing in this country. If you're a conservative Republican in the mold of a Reagan or a Bush or a Lee Atwater, any of that group, where do you go politically? You've been thrown out of the Republican Party. That's a shadow of what it used to be. The Republican Party has given up all of its major principles. It doesn't oppose big government anymore. It doesn't oppose deficit spending anymore. So where do those folks go politically? The folks who joined the Lincoln Project, where do they go and what constituency do they represent and what do they have to offer the country? So the whole political spectrum is beginning to shift and change and in very dramatic ways in a very short period of time. So it's going to be interesting to see what we as a civil rights community, what strategy and tactics we decide to employ to convince the rest of the country that expanding the democratic pie is the best way to go. And saying to people, civil rights is not a zero-sum game. It doesn't mean you have to lose in order for someone else to achieve their rights. We got to get people out of that notion because that is one of the major stumbling blocks to getting certain parts of the country to see that civil rights could benefit everyone. When I do fair housing trainings, one of the things I make very clear in that training is that civil rights are not just for Black folks. We fought for civil rights because we had a vested interest in the outcome. But either it's going to be a democracy for everybody or it's not.
So good.
And America's going to have to come to grips with this if we're not going to rip ourselves to pieces.
So good. Thank you for that, Bob. And reminding and centering us in that. Andrew, things to add there and also in terms of like, what do we do in this moment? How do we help people make those connections who are really recharged and energized in this moment as well?
Yeah, I think quickly, Whit, because I know you still got some other stuff you want to cover. I think I would say that I don't think we know yet if people's minds are changed, which I think is a pretty deep thing to say. A changed mind. I think we have to see what happens on the action and policy side. I do think we can say that a lot of people's minds seem to be alerted, that there are a lot of people who are aware or thinking about it or giving attention to it now. And now we have to see if and I think that's been a significant amount of growth, meaning I think there's a lot of people who have been alerted in a significant way that they weren't before. And so to Bob's last point, I think part of what we need to do is create broad public education mechanisms that are able to demonstrate to people in a variety of different ways where they come from: faith communities, educational institutions, local civic groups, and again, to Bob's point, all around the country. I don't think it cannot be limited to places where it's an echo chamber, but a broad public education base where people begin to understand the connection between segregation and discrimination and racial inequality and how that is manifested. And that segregation has been used as a tool to create this kind of discrimination and then enforce the outcomes, and that really is in violation of almost everybody's ethical principles, and that it's bad for everybody, to Bob's point. And so I think though the only way to, or one of the significant ways we have to deal with that is to have a broad, far-reaching, long-term public education campaign. And we do that pretty well, I think, locally and in Massachusetts. But we're going to need that to be broader and ongoing. And if we really want mind change, otherwise, I think the attention span will dissipate and it'll be something else in the future. So I think we have to dig in for the long haul on it if we want mind change.
I love that long-term sort of framing. So it's some intentional work that we really need to do long-term, which leads well into my last question, which is, what is our unfinished work? What more innovative solutions should we be exploring in furthering fair housing? What is at stake? What must we be further considering in our work to enhance the moment to advance equity and fair housing, right? What is our unfinished work? Bob?
Well, again, as I had said earlier, the expansion of civil rights, but I think we have to even go beyond the concept of civil rights and start talking about human rights. You'll see the slogan every once in a while, housing is a basic human right. And I think it is. We need to expand that concept into all areas of our economy because you cannot have a political democracy unless you have economic democracy. The two have to go together. You can't have folks divided up, or at least in theory, equal in terms of citizenship and voting, but completely unequal when it comes to economic resources. That's been tried, that doesn't work, it hasn't worked anywhere. And we need to really start talking about the expansion of democracy into economic spheres and talk about what it means for environmental justice, healthcare, all across the board. And I think if we can bring that kind of sentiment to the American people, broadly speaking, as Andrew suggested, I think we can start winning more hearts and minds.
Great. Yeah.
I think I'll bring this to sort of locally at a state level, some action items to make that a little pithy, and some of these are pushing it a little, but I think there's a lot of things we could do, but three things that I would think about as it specifically relates to housing right now. I think we should very seriously consider initiating and affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation and process at a state level. I think we should not be relying on the feds for that. We saw what happened in the last round. That's a disaster. We go another turn and we don't hold responsibility in both an ethical and a legal framework at a state level that's enforceable. We're totally exposed to what the feds do one way or the other. And I for one, don't want to be there again. So I think we should consider elevating that to a state level. Two, I think we should implement all of the amazing good things that happen as a part of the housing choice legislation, including the multifamily housing by right near transit and all the good stuff that Rachel and Eric and the team at CHAPA work so hard to create. We want a lot of things there, but now all of that has to deal with implementation. And I think there's already some concern about, are we really going to do all that? Or did it just get passed? And so now the doing of it, this is to my new friend Chad's comment in the chat there. Now we got to do it. So there's a lot there that has been approved that we have to make manifest in reality. And the last one is maybe the most brassy, which is, I think we should consider moving beyond incentives at a state level to requirements. I think we have treated a lot of the affordable housing work, especially as it relates to fair housing around access and location, as if it was based on an incentive system, as if it was negotiable. We treat things that we think are goods but are not essential with incentives. I'm incentivized not to eat a gallon of ice cream when I go home tonight so I don't weigh 50 more pounds tomorrow. That's an incentive, but it's up to me. It's a good as to whether or not I decide to do it. We don't treat essential things like that. We treat essential things as requirements. We don't treat, for example, ADA access in a particular municipality based on an incentive and whether or not they think that's a good idea in that community. It's not up to them. It's beyond their ethical pay grade, as it were. And I think we should very much consider marrying our intent on these issues to some significant type of requirement, like a relationship that's beyond attachment to MassWorks money, which is a good move, right? Attaching things to MassWorks is an incentive. If you don't do this good housing work, you're going to lose access to resources. But we could take steps further than that. We could attach it to Chapter 70. We could attach it to the way we fund local municipalities from state taxes. Now, all of that is extreme as a view. I get that. But if we really want to do it, I think we should take the steps that demonstrate that we hold fair housing and access and opportunity and stability as an essential good and not as a negotiable good. And if it's an essential good, it should be required. If it's a negotiable good, we can treat it like an incentive. So we should be consistent in the way we handle it. And I believe we have been flagged for closure. So,
and I would add one thing to Andrew's list, and that's zoning. On December the 9th, the city of Boston became the first city in the country to put fair housing language and principles in its zoning code. We should make sure that happens in every city and town throughout the Commonwealth.